Okay, so I'm going to make a quick disclaimer about the presentation. The deck is very good, and if anyone gets a copy of it, it's worth going back and looking at it because I'm going to cover some of the slides with a lot. They have a lot of content kind of quickly. Yes.
Can we maybe dim the lights or something? It's kind of washed out.
Yeah. Can we dim the front lights? So the slides will be available, and is that as good as it gets? There we go. Okay. So the slides will be available. There's good content on here. Unfortunately, due to technical difficulties, I had to recreate the entire presentation last night, starting at about 10 o'clock last night and finishing at about 20 minutes ago. So it's not exactly like the original presentation was. It's a little different, and I'm really not quite sure how to pace it because I've had no time to practice it. So I'm going to try and work through this. Bear with me. Good content. Not really sure how it's going to pace out yet because it's not exactly the same as what I thought I was going to be talking about. So, and I have no sleep. So this project was actually an extension of an OWASP project, computer-based training, which Nishi Kumar is putting together. A lot of the training was oriented around PCI compliance and introductory training to the CWE, to the OWASP Top 10 for the financial sector. Because with PCI DSS2, there's now a requirement to be compliant with CWE and OWASP. So part of this OWASP project is to develop training to help finance industry with that, or financial industry with that. And this is the most recent kind of extension of that. Probably will also be eventually turned into a computer-based training, but since it just got done today, we'll see. All right. So the objectives we're going to go over today are, I'm going to introduce the organizations. Since I'm not quite sure the makeup in the room, we'll talk a little bit briefly about the organizations. Take a quick look at what PCI DSS version 2 requirements look like. I'm going to review the CWE Top 25 and discuss its evolution. The evolution of these standards, or the Top 25, the Top 10, these things are being referenced by a compliance body, right? Where they're saying comply to these things. The fact that they're evolving and how fast they're evolving is interesting if you're trying to be compliant. We're going to do the same thing with the OWASP Top 10. I'm going to take a look at mapping the PCI DSS version 2 requirements to both the OWASP Top 10 and to the CWE Top 25 and show where their gaps are. Where do they overlap? Where don't they overlap? And then I'm going to talk about kind of a high-level strategy for building compliance in an evolving world. Okay. PCI Security Standards Council, they are your friends at the credit card companies who want to help everybody be better. And actually, they've done a reasonably good job, although I think that I would get booed and hissed in certain audiences by saying that PCI has done a reasonably good job at defining some improvements in application security. But given I run a testing team for application security, so my job is to break things, if most application development teams actually followed PCI standards, I'd be a lot less successful, but they don't. So, data security standard. I'm going to talk about PCI DSS, which is one of the standards that they put out. And PCI DSS applies to all entities involved in the payment card processing. So there are some PA DSS, which is more of the back-end system stuff. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not going to talk about the PIN stuff, just PCI DSS. All right. So organizations we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about MITRE. MITRE is often perceived to be an extension of a government organization, but it's not. It's actually a non-profit organization, but it's funded by the government, so it has an appearance of being a government organization, but it's actually a collaborative research non-profit. MITRE publishes the CWE. How many people in here are familiar with the CWE? Common weakness enumeration? Okay. So if anyone's ever actually gone in there and started like thumbing through the, 800 different CWE entries that if you print it out is something like 1,400 pages, or if you go to the web page and try and convert it to a PDF and watch your computer puke, not that I've done that recently, but MITRE puts out the CWE, which is the Common Weakness Enumeration, which is a fairly detailed breakdown of all the variants of vulnerabilities that might occur in applications. might be some argument as to whether the breakdown that they have is maybe in some cases too granular, or that there's in some cases overlap between various weaknesses, but they are actively trying to work that and refine the list. They also publish a CVE, which is actual vulnerabilities in production systems that get publicized. They're also putting out the KPEC. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the KPEC. The KPEC is the Common Attack Pattern Enumeration, and that's basically where they're going to talk about, you have these weaknesses. The KPEC says, how would I test or how would I attack those weaknesses? So it's an attack framework. SANS, I think everyone in here, I think would be familiar with SANS. SANS has the Internet Storm Center, but they're probably most well known for their extensive set of security training courses, which are extremely inexpensive. So, I mean, everyone, take two, they're cheap. Okay, I'm lying about that. And they're somewhat of a fire hose. I don't know if anyone's tried their new online training program that they've got on now, but it's actually pretty good. I think I've had some of my team going through it. I've been through it. I actually prefer that myself, because if you go to a SANS training course, you're going in there to get a sip of water and they give you a fire hose, so it's kind of brutal. OWASP, what else do I need to say? Right? I think you're here, you're at LASCON, you're familiar with OWASP. OWASP is awesome. Okay, PCI DSS, non-software requirements. So I wanted to jump into this real quick first, because PCI DSS has requirements that can be applicable directly to software development, but it also has a bunch of requirements that are not related specifically to software development. So I'm going to be talking about the software development stuff, because I'm going to talk about OWASP Top 10, CWE Top 25, but it's important to recognize that there's a whole set of requirements that don't have anything to do with software. Things like what I call environmental controls. These are my own labels, right? Nobody, PCI doesn't have these. Environmental controls, antivirus, firewall, that kind of stuff. Things where you're trying to secure the environment. Business processes, things where they say you have to have a policy for this, you have to test on this kind of a basis, you have to do these types of checks, right? Those are business process things. And they also have physical controls, which is like monitor physical access, disposal and storage of media, guns, gates, guards, that kind of thing. So we're not going to cover those. We're just going to cover all of the ones that would apply to the software area. Okay. There are 12 high-level, top-level sets of requirements for PCI DSS, and you'll see some of the things I talked about just a second ago repeated in here, like requirement number 1, which is install and maintain a firewall, protect cardholder data, right? Do not use vendor-supplied defaults and systems. We actually will cover that one, although that might be argued that that's an environmental thing. From a software deployment standpoint, I would argue it's not, right? You cannot deploy a lot of software without deploying it as part of a framework, as part of an application server, as part of a web server. So I consider that part of the application issue. Protect stored cardholder data, encrypt transmissions of cardholder data. I'm sure checkmarks followed all of this. Antivirus is an environmental issue. I'm not going to go through all of this. This just gives you an idea of what these top 12 high-level things are. When you get down in here to maintain policy that addresses information security, this gets into some of the policy and some of the physical security aspects as well. Okay. PCI DSS requirement 6.5. So a lot of what people associate with OWASP Top 10's relationship to PCI DSS is because of what's in requirement 6.5. 6.5 has a list that looks a lot like the OWASP Top 10 from 2004 merged with 2007. But it's not quite 10, it's only 8. But it looks similar. But what's interesting is in PCI DSS version 2, it references 3 external resources where you would now have to be compliant. OWASP guides. Okay, now this doesn't say the OWASP Top 10, but we're using the OWASP Top 10 here because our efforts to get our friends at PCI to actually give us a clear answer on what they meant by OWASP guides didn't actually end up getting a clear answer. So for you auditors out there, I guess it's up to your interpretation. SANS CWE Top 25 and the CERT secure coding guides. I'm not going to cover those because I'm really talking about weaknesses and vulnerabilities in software as opposed to secure software development lifecycle, which is more where this would fit in. But you do also have that. And those guides, if you haven't looked at those guides, they're actually very good. So the requirements that come out of 6.5x, these are the 8 requirements that look a lot like, if you were to take the OWASP 2007 and the OWASP 2004 and kind of cherry pick your favorite things on there, you might come up with this list of 8 things, right? So it's interesting because in 6.5, in most of the document, one of the distinctions I want to make too is the PCI document is requirements, right? Theoretically, it's saying this is what you should do, where the OWASP Top 10 and the CWE Top 25 are talking about weaknesses or risks or vulnerabilities or however you want to, everybody's got their own word for it. I prefer the vulnerability, but since nobody's using that, we'll call it a weakness. This is where PCI DSS actually lists some weaknesses, but they preface it in the DSS by saying, don't allow these things to be present in your software. And that's the requirement, and then they go on to list, these are kind of the listed out items. But if you'll see when we look at the OWASP Top 10 that they probably pulled this list from the OWASP Top 10. Okay. The CWE SANS Top 25. The first Top 25 list that CWE published was published in 2009. Came out with a huge fanfare, right? They had kind of followed in the tracks of OWASP. OWASP had published the first Top 10 list in 2004, and that got a lot of publicity. A lot of people went out and looked at that. A lot of people referenced it. You started seeing tool vendors who were publishing reports saying, hey, this is related to the OWASP Top 10 item, and so it got a lot of press. Well, then CWE came out with theirs at 10 wasn't enough. We're going to go with 25. And now you'll see the same thing. A lot of tool vendors are now starting to reference the CWE Top 25, and you're seeing these kinds of compliance issues where they're saying, oh, you should use the OWASP Top 10 and the CWE Top 25. And one of the struggles that I run into as a security tester is when somebody says, I've covered all of the top 25, my software is secure. Oh, well, clearly there's no other vulnerabilities besides this 25, right? So one of the things I think as security professionals that we need to make sure that we're educating the rest of the organization on is when they see these lists, especially sometimes our executives, they see a top 10 list. 10, that's easy. Those are, you can put that on one slide. That's bullet points. We can solve that, right? As long as you understand that you're, at that point, you're catching some important issues, but you're not catching all of the issues. And I think that's one of the challenges that I run into. I know other people are also running into that same issue. So if we take a look at this list, a lot of these are very good items, right? Improper input validation, failure to preserve SQL query structure. A pet peeve of mine with the CWE is they don't stick with the naming conventions the rest of industry does. They like to make their own, and they typically like to make them longer. And we'll see how that gets even worse as we move into 2010. So untrusted search path, incorrect calculation. I mean, some of these, in 2009, it was, the way that they created the list was kind of a, let's find some people who understand security, application security. We're going to get a collection of people, around 40 or so, and we're going to ask their opinion. We're not going to set any boundaries. We're not going to say how it has to be done. We're just going to say, what do you really think? And there were some high-level guidelines, but mostly it was a swag. And so this is the list that came together. I remember when I first saw this list in 2009, I thought, really, that's the best list of 25 you could come up with? And I particularly did not like this being on the list. Client-side validation as a top 25 weakness in software. I don't even consider that security control. I'm not sure why it was there. So, my pet peeve. So if we look at their transition as they go from 2009 to 2010, this is important because we're talking about 1 year, right? In 12 months, they're going to edit their list. Which, if you're trying to be compliant to that list, how long does it take you to say, okay, I'm now compliant with these 25 things? How much work and how much time did it take to get your application compliant with this when suddenly 2010 list comes along and these are the only items that are still left on it in 2010, right? From 2009 to 2010, everything else dropped off, okay? So that's an important transition. So not only did they drop off, then they reorganized. Oh, we're going to re-rate them. Now, granted, they came up with a better rating strategy. They actually were starting incorporating some measurements to try and come up with a scheme that would be more accurate to how severe these issues were. But then, this wouldn't be confusing enough, right? So let's rename a bunch of them. So now, you've changed your list significantly, you've reorganized your list, and you've renamed half of the list you had. right? So these are fairly significant changes, especially if we're talking about application development organizations who they didn't even know what cross-site scripting was, let alone improper neutralization of input during web page generation. I don't think most application security guys I talk to, if I was to say that to them, they'd be like, what? Right? Because cross-site scripting, if I say cross-site scripting, oh, okay, I got cross-site scripting. If I said improper neutralization of input during a web page generation, they'd be like, who are you? So, while technically the new names that they've given these things are probably technically more correct, they're way less user-friendly. All right. So then, these are the survivors from the 2009 to 2010, and this is the full 2010 list. So we get a whole bunch of new things in 2010. Probably one of the things that is most interesting about the 2010 list is that if you start looking here, we see classic buffer overflow, incorrect calculation of buffer size, integer overflow wraparound. You start seeing that there's like 5 variants or 6 variants of memory management issues that basically equate to a variant of buffer overflow. Okay, granted they're not technically not identical, but a couple of them are so close that when I had to go to a development team and say, this is what this one is and this is what this one is, I kind of went, this one is same thing. Just
the fix is same.
Same fix, just
Fixes all
do the same thing, yeah. Yeah, I mean, most of the, I mean, there's another one, the buffer one. So there's like 5 or 6 things in here. They're basically memory management issues with the same remediation. I probably wouldn't have done it quite that way, right? And I think that they realized that because when they came out with the 2011 list, they dialed back some of this multiple buffer overflow stuff. Not that buffer overflows aren't serious. I mean, clearly they are, but I don't think you need 5 or 6 variants of memory management issues. But a lot of these issues, these are still similar. A lot of these are still similar. You've got cross-site scripting, cross-site request forwarded SQL injection, hard-coded credentials, OS command injection. A lot of these are unarguably serious problems in the application. So now we're going to go from 2009 to 2010. We get a whole bunch more stuff drops off the list. Now you can't see it in this light, but there's actually this display is actually some color coded to show which things are staying on the list and which things are dropping off. But in this light, the color difference is so mild you can't tell. I wish I'd been able to test that out. Okay, so they dropped some things off the list, not as quite as bad from 2009 to 2010. They're not dropping quite as many things off. And then they reordered the list, just like they did in 2010. And then they put some new stuff on. What's interesting is number 11 actually was on the 2009 list, fell off the 2010 list, and came back in 2011. So, one of the issues I have at the moment, which I've talked to the guys at MITRE about, is this is getting, the CWE Top 25 is getting a lot of use right now. PCI is referencing it, tool vendors are referencing it, companies are trying to build compliance frameworks and policies around it. Changing it every year makes it very hard to manage, right? So OWASP publishes every 3 years, the top 10 list. CWE is currently publishing every year. I sat down a few weeks ago with the guy who's in charge of the CWE and discussed maybe slowing that down a little bit. Apparently I'm not the only person that's brought that up. Because the change is just, it's too much change. One, I would argue that the fundamental vulnerabilities in most software isn't changing that fast, right? New stuff is not coming to the forefront as the big hit item on any kind of regular basis. So if you can define, yes?
I just lost a moment, that's information security. At
Yeah,
information security. Wouldn't you really want the list to be cutting edge and accurate, and then when you have vendors aligning with them, they would just pick a year. They would say the 2010 or whatever. That way, it's accurate, it's useful in the field to use, and it's cutting edge. At the same time, you're referencing what version that you actually worked on. It's always going to be a snapshot.
Yeah, yes, granted. My argument as a tester myself, running a testing team, and I've tracked metrics on our testing for over 4 years. The the most common vulnerabilities in software aren't changing that quickly. I mean, new stuff shows up, and I think new stuff, if occasionally you get a new vulnerability or new weakness that comes on the scene, you need to account for that in the list, but not to the degree of change that we're seeing in the list here, right? I think it can change, but it needs to, the core should stabilize.
So you think they just shouldn't be as trigger happy, basically?
Yes, yes.
That makes sense.
And if we take a look at what the change looks like, and this is why. So this is kind of a summary. From 2009 to 2010, only 10 of the 25 items stayed on the list. That was 60% change in the list. Oh, yeah.
So since you've talked to, is Sean Barnum still on the CWE, or?
Rob Barnum. Yes. Yeah. Bob
So
Barnum.
they changed their code, or it seemed like they were attempting to be like exhaustive and come up with, a list that is, approaching or is coming to like exhausting categories, right? I mean, so they've changed that approach to now trying to condense it down.
Yeah, and they're coming up with, they're continuing to incorporate more, they're trying to incorporate more proof-based or metric-based decision-making now. So they're providing some guidance, and they're saying, we don't want you to just tell us off the top of your head what you think it is. What can you provide evidence based on, your testing or tool vendors' research, or, they're trying to make it a little more fact-based, where their first list was really kind of a swag, and each year they've added a little more criteria to try and refine the list. I actually think this last year's list is probably the best one they've put forward. So, one of the things, let me go back for just a second. Back here to, this was another one of my concerns is improper authorization, right? That's a big bucket. Lots and lots of things fall into improper authorization, like reliance of untrusted inputs in a security decision, which is improper authorization. And if you go look at the CWE, that is a child of that. So one of the things I think about is that really shouldn't most of these, you try and put them kind of on the same level, so you're not putting giant buckets in with the highly detailed level problems. Go back. All right, so from 2010 to 2011, 32% change in the content, 17 weaknesses stayed on the list. In 3 years, there was a 72% change in the list. That's significant. If you're trying to be compliant, if compliance is your target, or building policies around this is your target, or building software to meet these standards is your target, that's 72% in 3 years is a big change. All right, so how did OWASP do? Because clearly OWASP wouldn't shuffle things around like that. So 2004 list came out. This was OWASP's big, probably put OWASP on the map when the top 10 came out in 2004. It had a pretty good list. I actually like this list quite a bit. And then in 2007, half that list disappeared. Right? Just fell off. Then they reordered the list. Is this starting to look familiar to anyone? Drop stuff off, reorder the list, and then rename some stuff. Now, granted, the renaming is not as significant as it was with CWE, but same kind of thing. So then we have the top 10 for 2007. This is your full list, right? Then we go to 2010, which is the most recent list. We find this time 2 items drop off, which is still better, right? Now we've only dropped 2 items off, but we do restructure it, we reorder them, we reprioritize them. Again, I'm not really sure. Not only am I not sure that the fundamental vulnerabilities change, in my experience, the things that are the most severe or the things that are showing up the most frequently in tests aren't changing that often right now. I mean, so then they rename a couple of things. Again, these are minor renaming, but they still rename a couple of things, and they add a couple of new things on the list. And like with the CWE, in 2010, security misconfiguration comes back on the list. That was on the list in 2004. It was off the list in 2007. All right, so what does that mean? So from 2004 to 2007, there was a 50% change in the list. From 2007 to 2010, there was a 20% change in the list, and if you track that across for what stayed the same or what differed, how much change occurred over that 3 releases, it was a 60% change. right? So what does that mean, right? Everyone wants to be compliant. You want to have, you want to build your policies, you want to build your software to be compliant, but how do you be compliant with that, right? As soon as you think you're aiming at it, it moves. So one of the things that we have to do is first understand how do these things map out, right? So where, I think it's helpful to understand where you can kill more than one bird with a stone, right? Where can you knock out more than one item? So what this does is I've gone through the tier 2 requirements for PCI DSS. And this is based mostly on my input, so you can always argue the mapping, right? This is not, there's no authoritative source here. This is based on my own opinion. Gone through the tier 2 requirements that actually are software requirements, pulled all those out, mapped them against the OWASP top 10 and against the CWE top 25. In some cases, one is a bigger bucket than the other, right? In some cases, the OWASP top 10 is a bigger bucket. In some cases, the CWE is a bigger bucket. And in some cases, the PCI DSS is a bigger bucket. So you might have a case where the OWASP vulnerability is actually a subset of what PCI DSS is defined, or the same thing's true for the CWE. So CWE has things like the incorrect authorization, right? So incorrect authorization is a big bucket, and you can map several things across to that. But this is kind of the PCI view of things. If you look at it PCI and said, what kinds of weaknesses in the top 10 or the top 25, if I was to meet this requirement, which things would I knock out of that list? And so this is kind of a mapping of that. So it talks about, and I didn't break these out. You can go back to the list to see which these. I kind of ran out of room. Tried to put all the names of everything, but then the text got so small we would all use magnifying glasses. But it gives you an idea. And then you hit 6.5. 6.5 is the one where basically they have the OWASP top 10 like list. And this gives you an idea. I mean, clearly there are a lot of top 10 items and a lot of CWE items that map directly to 6.5. But it's important. A lot of people think 6.5 is the meat of software security compliance requirements in PCI DSS, but it's not. I mean, you can look, if you look through here, you can see here's all these ones in 2, 3, section 4, a lot of stuff, section 7, section 8. There's all kinds of software security requirements, but they're not easy to pull out because they're mixed in with process stuff and environmental stuff. And this gives you another mapping. So all the way up to the section 10. And then these requirements down here exist in the OWASP top 10 in the case of redirects, or just in the CWE for the dangerous uploads or download code without integrity check. So there's not a corresponding requirement that's really like that in PCI DSS. There's not a good mapping across there. But because they exist here, you do have to comply with them, because 6.5 says comply with top 10 and CWE, whether they called it out or not. So it's important to note there's not a good mapping here that goes to something in the PCI DSS. So this is my strategy. One of the things when we talk about compliance, if we've got a moving target, we've got a list that's changing a lot, can we roll the basic problems that these lists have been covering over the last few years into some high-level buckets and shoot for those buckets and say, if I can show or demonstrate that I am meeting those buckets effectively, can I use that as evidence of compliance? I mean, in some cases, the PCI DSS or OWASP or CWE is going to have some specifics that you have to meet within these buckets. But these buckets cover the existing CWE top 25 and the OWASP top 10 and the PCI compliance requirements, right? So the goal here was to come up with that set of kind of big buckets, a top 10 list, as it were, that is a little higher level and that covers the top 10, the top 25, and PCI DSS. And this is what comes up with. Sanitize data, right? Make sure your data that you're validating on the input, you're encoding. I thought about throwing on a little more detail in there because obviously there's more things you can do, but this gets the basics. Implement effective authentication, identity management, good password practices, and utilize multi-factor solutions when required, because PCI DSS does require multi-factor authentication for certain things. Implement appropriate authorization and access controls. There's a whole bunch of there's several places in PCI DSS where it's specifically talking about the implementation of effective access controls. And so if you do that, if you figure out how do you implement effective access controls, you're going to knock out a whole bunch of the requirements in PCI. Utilize well-vetted cryptography. Obviously, PCI DSS talks a lot about cryptography, both protecting data in storage and data at rest, and they have some specific ways that they talk about it and about implementing it. So you take care of that, right? That's that's another common issue that you'll see in the CWE and the OWASP top 10 is cryptography. Ensure communication channels for sensitive transactions are secured. That's, again, a lot of these are similar to OWASP top 10 items or CWE items, but in some cases they're bigger buckets. Lock down systems before deployment. Use robust patch management. Locking down systems means covers several of the PCI requirements around things like get rid of vendor passwords and change default settings and get rid of services you don't need on commercial software. Disable service ports protocols are not required for your business operation, that kind of thing. So make sure you're locking your systems down, and once you've locked them down, make sure they stay patched. Ensure your code utilizes safe memory handling. There's several places in PCI DSS and CWE where they talk about buffer issues and memory management issues. So you have to cover that because it's specifically called out. You want to ensure your data is protected when stored and that's not stored when required. So there is at least one place in PCI DSS where it says don't ever store this. We don't care what you do, don't ever store it. But most of the time it says when you store it, make sure you're encrypting it appropriately. Ensure all files, code, and functionality from untrusted sources is properly validated. Right? If you allow someone to upload a file, if you're doing code updates, right? You have code library updates. Are you validating that the code is coming from a recognized resource? Is it signed code? Do you know where it's coming from? Functionality from untrusted sources. You're seeing more of that now, particularly because people are pulling in, not so much in the financial sector, but you see that a lot, right? In web spaces where people are pulling on ads or widgets or whatever, right? Do you know where that stuff came from that's now living on your site? Do you know it's safe? Are you checking it? Yes?
Yeah, with AdSec information security, we're a common criteria testing lab. With common criteria evaluations, you have to have third-party acceptance procedures. Yeah. So when you have third-party code or stuff that you didn't write at the various assurance levels, you need to have a plan that says, okay, did we do a code review? Did we do some extra testing before we vetted it inside? But if you just blindly buy it and plug it in, that's bad. So,
yes.
Yeah, that's actually a really big deal.
Yeah. And all of these are places where, I mean, honestly, if one of these goes wrong, right, if you allow the wrong kind of file upload, if you allow a code update from an unvalidated source, or depending on what you do with an untrusted source that you're using within your code, it could even be open source, right? You grab some little open source module that seems like it's handy dandy and solves your problem, and maybe it does. It may solve your problem, plus provide a handy backdoor for somebody.
It's good not to reinvent the wheel, but at the same time, don't just blindly trust.
Yes,
right?
yeah, blind
do
trust.
The same thing that you do for your code.
Yes.
When you have your code, you probably have code inspections like pairwise or something like that.
Yep.
Just document it. So
yep. And finally, implement good logging practices. This is a good thing to do anyway. For those of you who haven't seen the Secure Coding Practices Quick Reference Guide, I do have a whole section on logging. What should be logged? How do you log it? What do you do with the records to protect them? All that kind of stuff. And PCI DSS has several areas where they specifically reference logging for the purposes of audit, right? And have some specific requirements for that. That's it. I couldn't do it short. Questions? Comments? Tomatoes?
Just an observation. I read some of the PCIs and the products, and it seemed interesting to me that they were very focused only on credit cards. And for example, social security numbers didn't matter too much.
No.
Or customer data, as long as it was not attached to a credit card,
right.
was okay. So I thought it was a little, I think there's a few gaps in some of the
well, I think
they're focusing. I understand the
yeah.
credit card information, but the security perspective overall.
Yeah, but a lot of those other things either have different compliance requirements or no compliance requirements, depending on, and so, from an audit perspective, if you're auditing someone, you're auditing them specifically to determine whether or not they're compliant to something specific. So you might see lots of problems and say, well, that's bad, but it's not really outside of the scope of the audit, so it's not really that's not.
We're also PCI, USA, PCI is credit card data. For the credit card industry, it has nothing to do with being secure at all. It has everything to do with securing your credit card data. And that's it. So yeah, you're exactly right. That's why people laugh and say, oh, your PCI is secure, great. It's not that PCI sucks. It's just talking about credit card data. And that's the only thing it should be. It's a very specific focus. That was their objective.
The challenge is in some cases with the PCI problem is that there still is residual risk, because unless you completely segregated out your PCI environment, if someone owns something else close to it, or owns one of your administrator's machines and they get in, I mean, it's still not a perfect solution. But honestly, the PCI stuff does provide, if you were to implement this in broader scope than PCI, we would have lots of better software. So for what it's worth, it's still good.
Would you say in your experience that most internal companies take the various standards and compile their own normalized section themselves, or do people just use an OWASP guide, full car?
I've seen both.
Like either is more common?
And not that I've seen, but I mean, I don't do, my company works with other companies, but that's not our primary focus, so I don't see it as much as like a consultant would, because that's not what I do. So I'm probably not the best person to ask, but I've seen it done both ways in the places I have seen. I've seen some people just, say, okay, we're going to do the OWASP top 10, and that's all we care about. And I've seen other people say, okay, we're going to go through the CWE and OWASP, and what we've seen ourselves, and we're going to compile our own thing, right? And that's not necessarily a bad way to approach it, because the risks that you face in any particular industry might be different, right? And the way you're using your software, the way you're deploying your software, where you think your concerns are going to be, might be different, or the attacks that you're seeing against your systems might be different. So while I think it's good that these lists are out there, and they certainly call to attention common serious problems in software, there are other serious problems in software that are not mentioned in these lists, and you don't want to forget about that. Go ahead.
So the OWASP threat assessment, the white cell sheet that you can pull out and you plug in all the CIA information and it gives you the CVSS score. That has been very useful for some of the tribes just starting out in a big security program, because you show numbers, you show what they're exposed to, and how you say they start from a higher number, so that makes sense. It gives them a very easy way to go about things. Does the CWE have something like that, or is it something you don't have to pick up and work with?
The CWE doesn't have something specifically like that. I think the closest that you would get, if you're talking about incorporating the CWE in a modeling framework, is you're getting into threat modeling at that point, because you're talking about potential weaknesses within the system, and you conduct a threat model to identify where those weaknesses might occur. I think that would be the closest. And CWE, the MITRE, I don't believe has a published threat model framework. OWASP has some stuff on threat modeling that you can go through. There's some commercial stuff out there. Microsoft's published their threat model. But that's probably the closest. I mean, even then you have to kind of figure out how you would tie in. I mean, some of the new commercial tools are actually incorporating CWE stuff into the threat modeling scenarios that they put together, where they say, okay, here's the CWEs that would show things.
Comprehensive collection of all these things?
I don't do a lot of threat modeling. I've looked at the tools. None of the tools I've looked at I've been terribly thrilled with, but it's not my area of expertise, so I don't actually want to, I don't want to boo-hiss anybody, because that's not what I do. But looking into threat modeling, I know some people who spent some time trying to find a good threat modeling tool, And there are some good tools out there, but they take very different approaches. If you look at the results of the threat modeling from one tool to a different tool, the results can be quite different, and you're kind of going, why? You know, so I think the first step is in threat modeling is you don't actually have to have a tool to do it. The first step is to start understanding the process. If you want to do it internally, getting someone to start getting the expertise you need to do a threat model helps, because you don't want to take this threat modeling model or set of instructions and hand it to a development team who has no idea how threat modeling is supposed to work, because you crap in, crap out. Right?
Yep.
You really need to have someone who takes the time to understand what they're trying to achieve and what the goal is and how the threat modeling process works, and you kind of get a SME who can help with that, or bring in a consultant who can help you with that. But you don't initially. You don't really need a tool to get started. You can look at threat modeling frameworks and do some of it manually, right, to get started. Because then you'll understand, once you've done a few of them manually and you can kind of understand how it works, then you have a context in which to go talk to a vendor and say, show me what your tool does. And you can say, okay, now I can see how that tool would interact with what we've been doing, or it's better or it's worse or whatever. That would be my suggestion.
So do you know how many, what's the percentage of banks that they are really compliant with PCI DSS? What's really happening? Do they prefer to pay the fine?
You have to comply, because last year, June, they had, like, if the product uses payment, like does the credit card processing, if it is not PCI compliant, they cannot sell that product. They have to basically not. They basically.
Yeah, but again, it goes back to, you can have a deal with MasterCard or Amex, you may decide to pay the clients, right?
No.
I work for two retailers, both Global One, and that particular conversation comes up, especially since a lot of times it's cheaper to pay the fine on a recurring basis than to achieve PCI
You can
compliance.
keep doing it. You can.
Most people,
I can tell you, you can.
most people will achieve PCI compliance because brand defamation, if it ever gets out that you had a breach and you didn't.
But if
You weren't.
it's an internal product that you're not selling to other people, and you still have to do compliance yourself, as long as you're making progress towards that, that's often enough to satisfy management.
Yeah, because if you see banks, they have had systems, even before I was born, right?
Right,
They've
yeah,
got
they have
mainframes, a whole bunch of systems where, and you've got a whole bunch of requirements, encryption and credit card data is lying everywhere. So if they really start implementing that, you're talking about, multi-million-dollar fine.
Actually, that is kind of what I work for Turpin Nationals, and we went through PCI audit for 4 years. We went through all our systems, and that did get audited. And we got certification, and only after we got certification, now all of them, like, we ended with the
Now, it is important to keep in mind the banking industry, aside from PCI compliance, the banking industry is a huge target, right? In 2010, I think that the information I saw was that 2010, the banking industry lost something like $11 billion through fraud or hacking or fines or whatever, right? Things associated with security issues. That's huge, right? But they paid that. And from talking to some folks I know in the banking industry this year, that number's going to be significantly larger. So you're talking, they're already into the tens of billions of dollars in losses. It's kind of scary that they can actually write those losses off and still be doing great. So something's wrong with that picture.
Yeah, I would go before I'm saying, right?
I'm just saying. I'm just saying.
That's a good idea.
But you're not seeing them go out of business in general because of that, right? Some bad housing loans and some bad management practices, yes, but you're not seeing people going out of business because of security issues right now. Any other questions?
Okay, let's give it up for Keith Turpin.
Timing worked out good. Yeah, everyone's out a little early.
It was pretty good though for a last minute presentation.
Was it? Okay, I guess that's, was it okay, you guys? Because literally, this presentation